She was the kind of person most people passed by without noticing. Quiet, humble, and always blending in. Every morning she walked to work through the same narrow street, carrying a small bag and wearing the same soft smile. She never tried to stand out, never spoke loudly, and never sought attention. People at her workplace thought of her as kind, maybe even shy, but no one really knew her deeply. No one knew that deep inside her heart she carried a secret, one that had once defined her whole world. Long ago she had lived for music. The piano was her first love, her escape, her way of breathing. When she was young, she could spend hours sitting before the keys, lost in the sound that felt like it spoke directly to her soul. But life doesn't always let dreams survive untouched. Years passed and responsibilities took over. Bills had to be paid, family needed her, and reality quietly pushed her passion into the background. She told herself it was just temporary, that one day she would return to the piano. But that one day never came. Work grew busier, her days got shorter, and the piano she once played sat untouched in the corner of her small apartment, covered with a white sheet that slowly collected dust. Sometimes, at night, she would glance at it before going to bed. Her fingers would itch to lift the cover and play just one song, but she never did. It hurt too much to remember how it used to feel. Music wasn't just sound for her. It was emotion, freedom, and love. Losing it felt like losing a part of herself. At work, no one would have guessed this about her. She worked in a local office, managing papers, answering calls, and helping others. She was reliable and patient, the person people turned to when things went wrong. But no one ever asked what made her heart beat faster, or what dreams she had let go of. Everyone was too busy living their own lives. Her colleagues liked her but never really knew her. They saw her calm nature and assumed she had no big story, no hidden fire. But they were wrong. She just hid it well. In truth, every time she passed a piano shop window or heard someone playing in the distance, her heart stirred painfully. A mix of nostalgia and longing filled her chest, reminding her of who she used to be. One day after work, she stopped near a park where a street performer was playing piano beneath a tree. The music was soft and gentle, nothing complex, yet it pulled her in. She stood quietly, her eyes fixed on the performer's hands. Each note struck a memory. Her own fingers twitched slightly, moving unconsciously as if remembering the shape of old melodies. When the performer finished, people clapped. She smiled faintly and walked away, but her heart felt heavy. It wasn't jealousy she felt. It was grief, the grief of someone who once had that gift and let it fade away. That night, when she returned home, she finally walked over to the old piano in her living room. The sheet covering it had grown yellow around the edges. Slowly, she pulled it away. Dust floated in the air like tiny stars. The sight of those black and white keys made her throat tighten. She sat down and placed her hands gently on the keys, not pressing any of them. Her reflection in the polished surface looked older, wearier, but her eyes carried a flicker, the same light that had once lived in her as a child. After a long pause, she pressed one key. A soft sound filled the room. Then another. The tone was off, a little out of tune, but beautiful still. Her fingers began to move again, uncertain at first, stumbling, remembering. She played a small tune she had once known by heart. The sound echoed through her apartment, fragile but alive. By the time she stopped, tears had already gathered in her eyes. It was like meeting an old friend after years apart, but she didn't play again after that night. It was too emotional, too raw. She told herself it was enough just to touch the keys once more. She folded the cover back over the piano and went on with her routine, returning to her quiet, unnoticed life. Weeks went by. One morning, while she was at the community center where she sometimes volunteered, she overheard the organizers talking about a small charity event they were planning for the weekend. They needed music, someone to play piano for the guests. But the local musician who usually performed was out of town. They were scrambling to find a replacement. She listened silently as they discussed options, never saying a word. One of the volunteers turned to her and said jokingly, "Didn't you say once you knew how to play?" She smiled faintly and shook her head, brushing it off. "That was long ago," she replied softly. "I'm rusty now, but the others insisted." "Come on, even a simple tune will do." "It's for charity." She laughed nervously and said no again. Inside, her heart was racing. The idea of performing in front of people after so many years terrified her. What if she messed up? What if she froze? Still, the thought lingered in her mind all day. That evening, as she sat at her small kitchen table, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She stared at her piano again, wondering if she could still play something recognizable. She didn't know it yet, but life was quietly leading her toward something she could never have imagined. The next morning, one of the event coordinators called her directly. "We really need someone," they said. "You'd be doing such a kind thing. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just a few songs." She hesitated for a long time before finally agreeing. Her voice trembled slightly when she said yes, and after hanging up, she immediately regretted it. Panic set in. She hadn't practiced in years. What if her hands had forgotten? But a small part of her, the part that still loved music, whispered that maybe this was the moment she needed. Maybe life was giving her one more chance. Over the next few evenings, she practiced quietly in her apartment. The first night, her playing was shaky. Her fingers were stiff and she kept hitting the wrong notes. But she kept trying. Each night, she grew a little more confident, a little more alive. The music slowly returned to her hands like a language she had never truly forgotten. It wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about feeling again. Each piece she practiced carried memories of who she used to be. Her heart softened, her eyes brightened, and she began to feel that long-lost joy again. Still, she kept her practice secret. She didn't tell anyone. To the world, she was still the quiet woman who blended into the background. But inside her, a quiet fire was burning again. By the time the day of the charity event arrived, she was both nervous and hopeful. She had prepared a few simple songs, nothing fancy, but enough to fill the room with warmth. She told herself it would just be for a few minutes, then she could go back to her usual life. She didn't know that this event would open a door she thought was forever closed. That morning, she looked in the mirror before leaving home. For a moment, she didn't see the quiet office worker. She saw a glimpse of the musician she once was, when a confident, alive, passionate. She smiled softly to herself, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. As she walked to the venue, her heart beat faster with each step. The sound of people setting up, the chatter of volunteers, the smell of food. Everything felt alive and full of energy. But deep inside, she felt a familiar calm rising. The same calm she used to feel before performing many years ago. The piano stood in the corner of the room, a little worn, slightly out of tune, but to her, it was perfect. She ran her fingers gently over the keys, testing them. The sound was uneven but comforting. The event was about to begin, and she could already feel people's curious eyes on her. They didn't know who she was or what she could do. To them, she was just another volunteer, probably playing something simple to fill the silence. She took a deep breath, looked around the room, and smiled faintly. For years, she had lived quietly in the shadows, camouflaged among ordinary days. But that afternoon, without realizing it yet, she was standing at the edge of something extraordinary, a moment that would soon remind the world and herself of the beauty she still carried within. The day of the charity event arrived with a soft chill in the air. The community center buzzed with excitement as volunteers moved around, setting up chairs, food tables, and decorations. The smell of freshly baked bread and warm tea floated through the hall. People laughed, greeted each other, and children ran between tables. It was meant to be a lighthearted day. No one expected it to turn into something unforgettable. In one quiet corner, the piano stood ready. It wasn't fancy or new. The wood was scratched, and a few keys looked slightly worn, but it had charm. The kind of charm that holds stories of every hand that has ever played it. She stood near it, her heart pounding so hard she thought others might hear it. She had arrived early, hoping to get used to the atmosphere. But the more she looked at that piano, the more nervous she became. She tried to calm herself by helping others set up. She arranged chairs, handed out papers, smiled at guests, and did everything except sit down at the piano. Her fingers felt cold, her throat dry. She had practiced for days, but now that the moment was real, all that confidence seemed to fade away. Then one of the event organizers walked up to her and said kindly, "You'll be wonderful. Don't worry, just play from your heart." She smiled, though her smile trembled a little. Play from her heart. It sounded simple, but her heart hadn't been shared with anyone in years. Still, she nodded. The music inside her had been silent too long. Maybe this was its time to be heard again. As people began to fill the seats, she quietly sat at the piano and touched the keys. The sound was soft, uneven. She pressed one note, then another, checking the tone. Her hands were shaking slightly. From the corner of her eye, she saw children giggling, old friends chatting, people sipping tea. No one was paying her much attention, and that gave her comfort. She told herself, just start. Don't think, just play. When the host announced her, a few heads turned. She smiled shyly, gave a small nod, and took a deep breath. Her fingers rested on the keys for a long moment. The room fell quiet, not completely, but just enough that the sound of her first note carried clearly through the air. The moment she began playing, something inside her shifted. The nerves didn't disappear, but they turned into something else. Focus, emotion, life. The first tune she played was soft and slow, one she had practiced endlessly as a child. It flowed gently like a calm river. Each note carried warmth and familiarity. She could feel her hands remembering on their own. People in the crowd began to notice. The chatter softened. Heads turned. The music had a strange pull. It wasn't loud or complex, but it was full of emotion, something deeply human. Her fingers moved faster, stronger, more confidently, and then something remarkable happened. Her expression changed. The shy, quiet woman who had walked in that morning seemed to fade away. Her posture straightened, her eyes softened, and a small smile appeared. She was no longer playing for others. She was playing for herself. Each note brought back memories. The long nights of practice, the small performances from her younger days, the people who once believed in her. For a brief moment, time disappeared. The world around her vanished, and all that existed was the music. When she finished the first piece, there was silence, the kind that comes after something beautiful but unexpected. Then came applause, loud, genuine applause that filled the hall. People looked at her with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. She felt her face grow warm, almost embarrassed, and quickly bowed her head in gratitude. She hadn't expected that reaction. To her, it had just been a simple tune, but to everyone else, it was something more. It was honest. It came from a place of real feeling, and people could sense that. The host encouraged her to play another. She hesitated, then nodded. Her fingers returned to the keys, and this time she chose a melody that was entirely her own, something she had written many years ago but never shared. The sound was deeper, more emotional, and with every note her confidence grew. People leaned forward, drawn in. Some even closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. It was as if she was telling a story without words, a story of loss, love, and rediscovery. Halfway through the piece, she noticed a little girl in the front row watching her closely, eyes shining with awe. That small face gave her courage. She smiled gently at the child before continuing, her fingers dancing more freely. By the time the final note faded, the entire hall was still. The sound of the piano lingered in the air like a memory that didn't want to leave. Then once again applause filled the room, louder, longer this time. People stood clapping, smiling, cheering. She stood up, overwhelmed. She didn't know what to do with all that attention. All she could do was bow and whisper a quiet thank you. She had never imagined something so simple could mean so much. After she stepped away from the piano, people came up to her, asking how long she had been playing, where she learned, and why they had never seen her perform before. She blushed at their questions, answering softly, "It's been a long time since I played." What surprised her most wasn't the praise. It was how she felt inside. She felt alive again. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the quiet woman blending into the background. She was someone with a story, someone who had something to share. One of the guests, an elderly man who had been sitting quietly through the event, approached her with gentle eyes. "Your music," he said softly. "It speaks from the soul. Don't hide it again." His words stayed with her long after he left. As the evening ended and people started leaving, she sat alone at the piano once more. The lights were dimming and the hall was quiet again. She pressed a few keys softly, almost like a whisper to herself. The sound echoed beautifully in the empty room. It wasn't perfect. Some notes were uneven, some timing slightly off, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had found her way back to music, and somehow music had found its way back to her. When she walked home that night, the air felt fresher, lighter. The streets were mostly empty and she could hear her own footsteps echoing on the pavement. She smiled to herself, remembering the applause, the faces, the feeling of her hands moving across the keys. Back in her small apartment, she turned on a soft lamp and uncovered her old piano again. This time she didn't hesitate. She sat down and began to play. The melody flowed gently, and though it was late, she didn't care. The sound filled the room like light spilling into darkness. As she played, she realized something important. It wasn't about being perfect or about impressing others. It was about being real. The music didn't just live in her fingers, it lived in her heart. She thought about the years she had spent hiding, living quietly, afraid to show her true self. And now, after all that time, it had taken one unexpected invitation to bring her back. She didn't know what the future held, whether she would ever perform again, or if this had just been a one-time thing. But she did know one thing. She would never let her gift disappear again. That night, as the city slept, she played one last tune before closing the piano. She looked out the window at the stars, feeling at peace. It was as if life had whispered to her, "You're not done yet." And she believed it. She turned off the light, smiling quietly to herself. Tomorrow would be a new day. A different day. A day where she wouldn't just blend in, because now she had something inside her too powerful to hide. Her heart was full, her soul awake, and though she didn't yet know it, her story had only just begun. Days passed after the charity event, but the memory of that afternoon stayed alive in her mind like a warm melody that refused to fade away. The sound of the piano, the applause, the faces smiling back at her. It all replayed in her head again and again. It had been years since she had felt something so powerful, something that made her heart come alive again. At work, her colleagues were still talking about it. Some had attended the event. Others had watched the short clips that people had shared online. They couldn't believe it was her, the quiet woman who always kept to herself, now seen sitting at a piano, playing like she was born to do it. When people asked her why she never told anyone she could play, she just smiled and said, "It's been a long time since I did." She didn't know how to explain what that moment meant to her, or how much courage it had taken just to sit in front of that piano. What she didn't know was that her life was slowly starting to change. A few days later, she got a message from one of the volunteers who had recorded her performance. The video had been shared online, and to everyone's surprise, it was spreading quickly. People were commenting about how beautiful and emotional her playing was. Some said the music brought them peace, others said it made them cry. The video was being shared by strangers, reaching people far beyond her small town. At first, she didn't believe it. She thought it was just a few kind comments. But when she opened her phone and saw the number of views climbing higher every hour, her hands shook. She read message after message, people from different places thanking her for the music, for the feeling it gave them, for reminding them of something they had lost. It was overwhelming. She had never imagined her music would touch so many people. She had played only because she wanted to feel alive again, not for fame, not for attention. Yet here it was, reaching hearts she would never meet. At first, she didn't tell anyone how much it meant to her. She just kept quietly checking her phone, smiling each time she read a new comment. But one evening, as she sat at her piano, she began to cry softly. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. Life had given her a second chance in the most unexpected way. The next weekend, the same community center invited her to perform again. This time, not as a replacement, but as their special guest. They wanted her to play for a larger audience as part of a local music night. When she received the call, she hesitated. Her old fears returned. What if this time she couldn't play as well? What if people expected too much from her? She was just an ordinary woman, not a professional musician. But then she remembered the faces from the charity event, the people smiling, clapping, feeling something real. She realized it wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. So she said yes. The days leading up to the event were filled with practice. Each evening after work, she sat at her piano for hours. Her hands grew more confident, her touch softer and more expressive. She tried new melodies, mixed them with old ones, creating her own sound and something that came from deep within. Sometimes, she would pause and close her eyes, letting her fingers wander across the keys without thinking. The music that came out was pure emotion, the sound of her heart speaking without words. The night of the event arrived faster than she expected. The community hall was decorated with lights and flowers, and the air was filled with anticipation. People from nearby towns had come, many of them having seen her video online. She could hear them whispering, "That's her, the woman from the video." She stood backstage, breathing slowly to calm herself. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had once been afraid to touch the piano again. Now they were steady, ready. When her turn came, she walked onto the stage quietly. The lights were warm, the audience silent. She sat down at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few notes floated through the hall, soft and calm, like a whisper. Then the melody grew deeper, fuller, filled with feeling. Her fingers moved with confidence, but her expression stayed gentle, almost peaceful. She wasn't performing. She was sharing. Each note carried a piece of her story. The years she spent hiding, the loneliness, the rediscovery, the hope. The room felt alive, as if everyone there could feel what she felt. About halfway through, she noticed an elderly woman in the front row wiping away tears. A young man beside her had his eyes closed, listening deeply. The audience wasn't just hearing music. They were feeling it. When the final note faded into silence, the room remained still for a few seconds, and then, as if waking from a dream, the crowd erupted in applause. It was louder than before, more emotional. People stood, clapping, cheering, some even shouting her name. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly, and bowed. Her eyes were wet, her heart full. For years she had hidden behind quietness, afraid of being seen, and now, in this moment, she wasn't hidden anymore. After the performance, people came up to her one after another, sharing how the music had touched them. A young girl told her she wanted to learn piano because of her. A man said the melody reminded him of his late mother. An older woman said it gave her hope again. She listened to each one, her heart swelling with emotion. All her years of silence, all the pain she had carried, now felt worth it. Her music had given others something beautiful, and that was the greatest reward she could imagine. A few weeks later, her story appeared in a small local newspaper. They called her the Camouflaged Pianist. The article described her as the woman who had lived quietly among ordinary people, only to reveal a rare gift when given a chance. It was a simple story, but it touched many hearts. The attention grew slowly but steadily. Music teachers, local musicians, and even a few reporters reached out to her. Some wanted to collaborate, others wanted to feature her in community events. She was surprised, but she stayed humble. She never chased the spotlight. She simply followed the call of her music. Every evening, she continued to practice, not out of pressure, but out of love. Sometimes she would record small clips and share them online, dedicating them to those who sent her kind words. She would write short captions like, "For anyone who feels they've waited too long to start again." Those few words touched people deeply. Her story became a quiet reminder that it's never too late to rediscover who you are. Despite all the new attention, her life didn't change drastically. She still went to work, still greeted her colleagues with the same gentle smile. But inside, she was different. Her heart felt lighter, freer. She had something to look forward to each day, something that made her feel alive again. One night, as she sat by her piano, she thought about the journey she had been on. From being afraid to play again to finding herself through music, it all felt like a dream. She realized that what she had rediscovered wasn't just her talent, but her courage, her voice, and her purpose. Before going to bed, she played one last song, a new melody that came to her naturally. It was calm, hopeful, filled with quiet strength. As the notes drifted through her apartment, she smiled softly to herself. She didn't know what was coming next, but she no longer feared it. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that this was only the beginning, that her music still had more to say, and her story still had more to unfold. The camouflaged pianist, who once hid her gift from the world, was now stepping slowly into the light, not for fame, not for applause, but to share what had always lived in her heart, the simple, timeless beauty of music. Weeks turned into months, yet the echoes of her music continued to ripple far beyond the small community where everything began. The video of her first public performance had reached thousands of people, and more than the sound of her music, it was her story that touched hearts. A story of rediscovery, courage, and quiet resilience. Every few days, she would receive new messages from strangers thanking her for inspiring them. Some said her music gave them hope to try again. Others said it reminded them of loved ones they had lost. One message read, "You reminded me that forgotten dreams don't die. They just wait for us to find them again." Those words stayed with her. She never replied to all of them, but she read every single one. Each message reminded her why she had chosen to play again. Not to be seen, but to connect. Her life still looked the same from the outside. She worked the same job, lived in the same small apartment, and walked the same quiet streets. But inside she was completely different. Her heart now carried a quiet joy, a sense of purpose that filled even her most ordinary days. Some evenings, after finishing work, she would head straight to the community center. The organizers there had grown close to her. They admired her humility, her calm presence, and her willingness to help. She didn't just come to play anymore. She came to teach. Children would gather around her, sitting cross-legged on the floor, their small faces glowing with excitement. Some of them had never touched a piano before. She would sit beside them, guide their hands gently, and say softly, "Don't worry about the notes at first. Just feel the sound. Music should come from your heart." The children loved her. Her patience, her smile, and the calmness in her voice made them feel safe to make mistakes. She often told them stories about her own fears and how long it took her to find the courage to play again. One evening, a little boy who struggled with confidence looked up at her and asked, "How did you not give up?" She smiled and said quietly, "I almost did, but sometimes life gives you a small chance to start again. When that happens, don't turn away. Even if it's scary, take it." Her gentle words stayed with the children, and with many of the adults who came to watch her lessons. The way she taught wasn't just about music, it was about life. One afternoon, while she was finishing a small practice session at the center, one of the organizers approached her excitedly. "You won't believe this," they said. "A well-known charity foundation saw your video online. They're planning a national concert to raise funds for hospitals, and they want you to perform." She froze. Her first reaction was disbelief. Then came a wave of fear. A national concert? That meant performing on a big stage in front of hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. That was something she had never imagined for herself. "I'm not a professional," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "There are so many better pianists out there." The organizer smiled kindly. "They don't just want a pianist. They want you." They were moved by your story. They said your performance would remind people of hope. That night she sat in her apartment staring at the invitation letter. Her heart was torn between excitement and doubt. She walked to the piano and placed her fingers gently on the keys, as if asking them what she should do. For a long time she sat in silence, thinking about her journey, the years she spent hiding, the small charity event that started everything, the messages from people who found comfort in her music. Then she closed her eyes and whispered, "If this is meant to help others, then I'll do it." And just like that, she said yes. The following weeks were intense. Every evening after work, she practiced until midnight. Her neighbors could sometimes hear the faint sound of the piano through the walls, not loud or showy, but soulful, deep, full of feeling. She chose her pieces carefully, not the most difficult ones, but the ones that spoke to the heart. She wanted her performance to tell a story, not to impress. Each note she played was filled with gratitude, with the quiet strength of someone who had found her voice again after years of silence. Still, there were moments of doubt. Some nights she would stop mid-song, her fingers frozen above the keys, wondering if she was truly ready. But every time she felt that fear creeping back, she remembered the faces of the children she taught, their small, hopeful eyes watching her as if she could do anything. That memory always gave her strength to continue. Finally, the day of the concert arrived. The venue was large, and far larger than anything she had ever imagined. Bright lights hung from the ceiling, the stage polished and grand. Rows of seats stretched into the distance, already filling with people dressed in elegant clothes. Backstage, her heart raced. She looked at her reflection in a small mirror, her simple dress, her calm eyes, her trembling hands. It was strange. She didn't feel like a performer. She felt like a messenger. A stage manager approached and told her she would go on in 10 minutes. She nodded silently. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "You're not here to be perfect. You're here to feel." When her turn came, she walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding and the room was silent. For a moment, she could hear only her own heartbeat. She sat down at the piano, adjusted the bench slightly, and looked out at the crowd. Somewhere among them were strangers waiting to be moved by something real. Then she began to play. The first few notes were soft, uncertain, like a whisper testing the air. But as the melody grew, her hands found their rhythm. The music flowed out of her, pure and strong. The sound filled the hall, gentle yet powerful, sorrowful yet full of hope. The audience was silent, completely still. Every person in the room could feel that this wasn't just music, it was a story. As she played, she thought of all the moments that brought her here. The nights she spent in silence, the dust-covered piano in her apartment, the children's laughter at the community center. Every note carried those memories, turning her past into sound. Near the end, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from emotion. She closed her eyes for a second and let her heart take over. The melody swelled, filled with everything she had ever felt: pain, loss, love, courage. It was her truth told through keys and sound. When the final note faded, there was a pause, that sacred silence that only comes after something deeply moving. Then the applause came, rising like a wave, filling the entire hall. People stood clapping, cheering, wiping away tears. She bowed her head, tears in her eyes. For her, this wasn't a performance. It was a moment of healing, for herself and for everyone who had ever lost faith in their own light. After the concert, many people came to speak with her. Some thanked her for reminding them to keep dreaming. Others said they hadn't cried in years until that night. But what touched her most was when one woman approached her quietly and said, "You didn't just play the piano, you played our hearts." That night, as she left the venue, she looked up at the sky. The city lights shimmered like stars. Her heart was full, not of pride, but of peace. She realized she no longer needed to hide, no longer needed to doubt herself. She had lived in the shadows for so long, blending in, afraid to be seen. But life had given her a chance to step forward, not to show off, but to shine gently like a light in the dark, guiding others toward their own forgotten dreams. When she returned home, she placed her fingers once again on the piano. The same keys she had once avoided now felt like old friends. She played a quiet tune, slow and soft, smiling as she did. Her story wasn't about fame or success. It was about rediscovery, the courage to return to something you once loved, even after life had taken you far from it. And though she didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring, she knew one thing for sure: she would keep playing, not because the world expected her to, but because her soul finally had something worth saying. The camouflaged pianist had stepped out of the silence not as a performer, but as a storyteller, one who used music to speak the language of the heart. Months had passed since the national concert, yet she still remembered every detail as if it had happened yesterday. The applause, the quiet faces leaning in to listen, the feeling of music flowing directly from her heart. It stayed with her like a soft, glowing light she could carry anywhere. Life had changed subtly but profoundly. People now saw her differently, yet she remained the same gentle, humble woman she had always been. What had changed was not the world, but her courage to step fully into it. One morning, she received an invitation she could hardly believe. A renowned charity organization was organizing a large-scale concert in the city's main auditorium. They were gathering artists from across the country to raise funds for children's hospitals, and they wanted her to perform as the centerpiece. This wasn't just a local audience anymore. This was a stage for thousands with cameras, reporters, and live streaming. Her first reaction was fear. She thought of the enormous stage, the bright lights, the people watching her every move. Her mind filled with questions. Could she do it? Would she fail in front of so many? Could her music truly touch so many hearts? For days she wrestled with doubt. She played at her piano alone, trying to prepare. But the anxiety made her hands stiff, the notes uncertain. She felt the weight of expectation, not just from others but from herself. And yet amidst the fear, a quiet voice inside reminded her of all she had already overcome. She remembered her first public performance at the charity event, the children she had taught, the messages from strangers who found hope in her music. She remembered the feeling of her heart waking again after years of silence. Slowly, she realized that this wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about how fast or complex she could play. It was about the same thing it had always been about: sharing her heart, connecting with others, and speaking the language of the soul. Finally, she accepted the invitation. The preparation that followed was both intense and beautiful. She practiced late into the night, letting her fingers move freely, exploring melodies she had never tried before. She mixed her old tunes with new compositions, creating something entirely hers, something she hoped would carry emotion to every listener in the auditorium. Every night, as she played, she closed her eyes and imagined the audience, hundreds of faces waiting to feel something real. She played for them as if they were not strangers but friends, each note a quiet conversation, a story told without words. The night of the grand concert arrived. The auditorium was enormous, with rows of seats stretching into the distance. Bright stage lights hung above, waiting to illuminate her as she took her place. She could hear the low murmur of the audience settling in, the soft shuffle of programs being opened, the faint rustle of excitement. Backstage, her heart raced, but she breathed slowly, grounding herself. She remembered the small community hall where it all began, and how far she had come. She placed her hands gently on the piano keys, feeling their familiar texture, and whispered to herself, "This is your moment. Play with your heart." When her name was announced, she walked to the stage quietly, the spotlight following her every step. For a moment, she felt the weight of every eye in the hall upon her, but then she sat down, adjusted her posture, and closed her eyes. The first note rang out soft and pure. It floated into the air, a single sound carrying both fear and hope. Then came the next note and the next, and soon a melody emerged, delicate, flowing, yet strong. She had begun, and the music was alive. As she played, her nerves melted into focus. Her hands moved effortlessly, remembering patterns and rhythms she hadn't touched in years. But more importantly, the music carried emotion. Every sorrow, every triumph, every moment of doubt and courage she had experienced. The audience leaned in, captivated. They weren't just listening. They were feeling. Every pause, every rising note, every subtle shift in melody reached them directly, bypassing words. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others watched in awe, tears gathering in their eyes. In that moment, she wasn't just a pianist. She was a storyteller, a messenger, a human being sharing what words could not express. Her music spoke of rediscovery, hope, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from never giving up on yourself. Midway through her performance, she shifted into a piece she had composed herself, one that carried her story most clearly. It was a complex melody, full of tension and release, moments of sorrow followed by bursts of hope. As she played, she imagined the children in hospitals who would benefit from the concert, imagining the lives touched by every note. Her emotions poured into every key, and the audience felt it deeply. She noticed people in the front rows wiping away tears. A man in the second row was holding his wife's hand tightly, both moved silently by the music. Even in the back rows, people leaned forward, transfixed, listening as if every note were meant for them personally. As the final measures approached, she closed her eyes completely, letting her heart guide her. Her fingers danced over the keys, strong yet delicate, filling the room with a feeling of completion and release. The last note lingered in the air, suspended like a breath held between time. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Then the auditorium erupted in applause. The sound was thunderous, echoing off the walls, carrying the awe and gratitude of hundreds of people. Some rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, their faces shining with emotion. She sat still for a moment, letting the applause wash over her. Her hands were trembling slightly, her chest full. She had never imagined a moment like this. All her years of fear, hiding, and doubt had led to this. And now, standing at the center of such recognition, she realized something profound. It wasn't about fame or praise. It was about connection. It was about courage. It was about allowing her true self to shine for the first time in a long while. After the performance, reporters, organizers, and attendees approached her. They asked questions, praised her, and shared how her music had touched them. But she answered softly, humbly, always returning the focus to the message she wanted to share: that anyone can rediscover what they love, no matter how long it has been hidden. In the days that followed, news of the performance spread quickly. Videos were shared online, messages poured in from strangers across the country.